What if the greatest threat to your soul isn't a demon hiding in the shadows, but the systems you trust every day? What if the most dangerous influence in the modern world doesn't announce itself as evil, but arrives as policy, progress, and protection? This episode is about real-world power, not myths, not speculation, not fringe ideas. It's about governments that redefine morality, technologies that redefine humanity, and institutions that decide truth by compliance rather than conscience. There was a time when power knew where it ended. Governments governed behavior, not identity. Institutions shaped society, not reality itself. Technology served human life, but it did not attempt to rewrite what it meant to be human. Those boundaries mattered. Not because humanity was righteous, history proves otherwise, but because restraint still existed. There was an unspoken understanding that some authority did not belong to us. Some lines were not ours to cross. Civilizations rose and fell with that awareness, but something has shifted. Today, power no longer asks where its limits are. It asks why limits should exist at all. And the most unsettling part is this: the change didn't arrive through force. It arrived through agreement. If you've sensed that something deeper is happening beneath the headlines, something difficult to name but impossible to ignore, stay with me. And consider subscribing, because this series is about patterns most people never stop to question. This episode is not about superstition. It is not about panic. It is about a boundary that has been crossed, and how quietly it happened. Every era that overreaches begins with the same inversion. Limits are reframed as cruelty, moral hesitation is labeled harm, and restraint becomes the enemy of progress. What once protected humanity is now described as oppression. We're told that questioning authority is dangerous, that refusing compliance is irresponsible, that slowing down innovation is equivalent to causing suffering, and that moral objections are obstacles to be removed for the sake of efficiency. In this new framing, obedience is no longer about right and wrong. It's about safety, about optimization, about the greater good. Language does the heavy lifting. Words like care, equity, health, and security are used to justify decisions that would once have been unthinkable. And because these terms sound virtuous, resistance feels immoral. This is how power advances without appearing tyrannical. No one is dragged into agreement. They are guided there. And what makes this stage so dangerous is not that people are deceived by lies, but that they are persuaded by partial truths. Truths stripped of context. Truths detached from restraint. Boundaries don't fall in a single moment. They erode, one reasonable step at a time. Eventually, influence stops operating at the level of individuals. It enters systems, and systems are different. Systems don't argue. They don't explain themselves. They don't ask permission. They operate. Decisions are made far from the people they affect. Authority is exercised without faces, without names, without accountability. Power becomes abstract, distributed across frameworks so complex that no single person appears responsible. And because systems speak in the language of data, policy, and expertise, they feel neutral, rational, safe. But neutrality is an illusion. When authority no longer needs consent, it no longer needs truth. When power is justified by efficiency, it stops asking whether it is right and asks only whether it functions. This is where governments, technologies, and institutions converge, not as villains, as managers, managers of behavior, managers of speech, managers of acceptable belief. Before this episode ends, we will name the pattern behind this convergence, and we will show why Scripture warned about it long before modern systems ever existed. One of the most powerful deceptions of our time is the belief that systems are morally neutral. It's just policy. It's just technology. It's just how the world works now. Responsibility dissolves into process. When harm occurs, no one is accountable, because no one feels in control. The system becomes a fact of life rather than a moral agent, and this is why good people defend dangerous structures, not because they are malicious, but because the system feels inevitable. Resisting it feels futile. Questioning it feels uninformed. Evil no longer needs a face when it has a framework. And Scripture anticipated this exact condition, not chaos but order without conscience, authority without humility, power that no longer recognizes anything above itself. This is not the end of the story, but it is always the warning stage. The Bible does not describe evil primarily as chaos. That surprises many people. Scripture warns far more often about order without God than disorder without control, about systems that function smoothly while drifting morally, about authority that no longer sees itself as accountable to anything higher. Again and again, the warning is the same. Power that exalts itself beyond its rightful place. Authority that demands allegiance not just in action, but in belief. Structures that reshape truth, redefine worship, and reorganize human identity. This pattern is not described as barbaric. It is described as convincing. It arrives clothed in wisdom. It speaks with confidence. It promises stability, peace, and progress. And it frames resistance as ignorance or rebellion. Scripture does not warn believers to look for madness. It warns them to look for self-authorizing power. Power that no longer recognizes limits. Power that no longer asks permission. Power that believes its own justification is sufficient. These warnings were not written for ancient tribes unfamiliar with complexity. They were written for societies advanced enough to believe they had outgrown the need for restraint. The danger was never ignorance. The danger was authority that forgot it was not God. Now we can speak plainly. This episode is not about one organization, one government, or one technology. It is about alignment. Alignment between technological power that claims the authority to redefine humanity. Alignment between ideological systems that enforce moral conformity. Alignment between institutional structures that govern truth through compliance rather than conscience. Each of these elements can exist independently. The danger emerges when they converge, when technology no longer serves human limits but seeks to replace them, when ideology no longer persuades but mandates, when institutions no longer guide but condition. This is not conspiracy, it is structural reality. And this is why focusing on logos, names, or individual leaders misses the point. People come and go, administrations change, technologies evolve, but the pattern remains. The danger is not who holds power, it is how power understands itself. When authority sees itself as the highest reference point, restraint disappears. And when restraint disappears, conscience becomes a liability rather than a guide. That is the line, and it has been crossed before. History is remarkably consistent on this point. Civilizations do not collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they are convinced of their own moral authority. When systems move from stewardship to authorship, something fundamental breaks. Human beings become variables. Dissent becomes dysfunction, and truth becomes something to be managed rather than discovered. At this stage, power must continue expanding, not because it wants to, but because it has no higher boundary to stop it. Every exception becomes precedent. Every compromise becomes permanent. And the system must grow increasingly aggressive, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because authority without restraint cannot tolerate limits, and power without humility cannot endure opposition. Scripture does not describe this moment as sudden destruction. It describes it as exposure. What was hidden becomes visible. What was justified becomes undeniable. And what demanded allegiance eventually demands worship. This stage is never the end of the story. It is the warning before it. This is where the conversation becomes personal. Not because you control these systems, but because you live under them, benefit from them, rely on them, and sometimes support them without realizing what they require in return. The question is not whether these structures exist. The question is where you draw the line. At what point does convenience become complicity? At what point does safety become surrender? At what point does silence become agreement? The most dangerous moment is not when power becomes corrupt, but when it becomes unquestioned. Scripture never instructed believers to panic. It instructed them to discern, to test spirits, to examine authority, to remember that no system, no institution, and no power structure outranks truth. If this episode resonates, share your thoughts below. Where have you seen this alignment forming? And how do you believe people of faith should respond? And if you want to continue this conversation, consider subscribing. This series is not about fear, it's about clarity. In the next episode, we'll examine what happens when these systems stop merely influencing behavior and begin demanding allegiance. Because history, scripture, and experience all agree on one thing. Once the line is crossed, something is always required in return.
Cheers!